Barnes & Noble Audio.
I felt to write this book, I had to be as fearless as my own main character, you know? I was like, I really had to go for broke, be unafraid of the material, and be unafraid of going to some really dark places.
That's the writer Laura Lippman talking about her new novel, Sunburn. I'm Bill Tipper. Each week on the podcast, we talk with writers about the stories that didn't make it onto the page. Laura Lippman is the author of 12 mystery novels featuring Baltimore PI Tess Monahan and 10 works of fiction that blur the boundaries of crime fiction, suspense, and family-oriented drama, including Every Secret Thing, which was adapted as a film in 2014, What the Dead Know, I'd Know You Anywhere, After I'm Gone, and Wild Lake, among others. She's also the author of a collection of short stories, Hardly Knew Her, and the editor of the collection Baltimore Noir. Lippman began publishing fiction when she was still a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and since then has been the recipient of more awards than we have time to name here. We could mention in passing the Agatha, the Anthony, and the Edgar. And she's been credited with being one of the writers taking American crime and mystery fiction into an expansive new phase. Her latest novel, Sunburn, can't be said to be a departure. It boasts the hallmarks of a great Laura Lippman tale, a precise set of place, a sense of brooding suspense accompanied by a seven veils-like dance of multiple revelations, and a blend of determined realism and aching melancholy. Set in the 1990s, Sunburn begins with the arrival in a Delaware town, the kind of town most people pass through on their way to the beach without even noticing, of a woman who's definitely going to be noticed. When she joined us in the studio recently, I asked Laura Lippman how her new novel, with its echoes of classic literary and filmic works of suspense, first took shape.
I wish I could remember the exact moment that I came up with the idea for Sunburn, and it's not really burned into my mind the way that some other books are. But one thing I do know is that I had sort of, without noticing it myself, changed up the way I was working. For many years, it was really almost second nature to me to be inspired by real-life stories, the kind of stories that were in the newspaper in my hometown of Baltimore, usually not big national stories. And I often like to write about things I would say were from the pre-CNN era, before news became so nationalized. You know, at a time when I was growing up, two sisters could disappear and it wasn't national news. We only knew about this in Baltimore and Washington. That was one real case that inspired one of my books. But without realizing it, I had become more and more interested in writing books inspired by books that I loved. And I first did that with Wild Lake, where I asked myself the question, if one decides that one is going to believe victims of sexual assault when they come forward, what do we do with the book To Kill a Mockingbird? How does that change? Obviously, I do believe it's a false accusation. That's the entire point of the book, and it's not a real person. But what happens if you bring this very modern sensibility to this old book, and what era would it be set in? I was like, no, present day, we're too aware for this story, but wouldn't it be interesting to look at the story in the 70s and 80s when people had a false pride in how evolved they were on issues of gender and race? So that was Wild Lake.
All right, wait, are you saying that we don't have a false pride now about how evolved we are?
we still do. We still do, but at least we have, the term woke now that's used almost ironically. I mean, I think the minute that you say you're woke, you're not woke, if I understand the term. So
Wild Lake came out of that.
Wild Lake came out of the love of this book I adored. And one of my favorite writers was James Cain, one of the most influential writers, was the writer when I started out 20 years ago, I thought I was going to be, and I found at the time I couldn't write in the key of noir. I had this funny little voice that kept popping out, and that was the voice that was appropriate to the Tess Monahan series, which I always say has a kind of rueful optimism about the human condition. And I came back to Cain, and I was thinking a lot about his work. And it's not just The Postman Always Rings Twice, although that's sort of the most obvious ancestor of Sunburn. Mildred Pierce, which is my personal favorite, Double Indemnity with all the insurance fraud.
This novel made me think about Double Indemnity a lot.
Good. And then finally, I'd always been obsessed with Ann Tyler. How can one not be in Baltimore?
Mm-hmm.
She is our greatest novelist. I think it's interesting because I don't consider Ann Tyler a Baltimore novelist. I consider her a great novelist who happens to live in Baltimore. And she sets her books there, but she's not particularly interested in the city as her subject. It's a backdrop for her. Her stories, she would be writing brilliant novels wherever she lived, and they might be set there, whether it was where she went to school in the Carolinas or where she grew up in Minnesota. But in 1995, she published a book called Ladder of Years, which is about a woman who gets sick of her family on vacation and walks away from them. And it's Ann Tyler, so it's funny, and it's so insightful about the human condition, and it's compassionate and empathetic, and I hesitate to use the word heartwarming because that makes it sound corny, but it's a great book. But that's a dark idea. It's a really dark idea. And I thought, I want to explore the noir version of that. For people who watch Stranger Things, I now think of it as the upside down version of Ladder of Years. What is the complementary dark version of this very beautiful, lighthearted story? And if you take A Postman Always Rings Twice and the person passing through town is a woman, what happens next? And there I was.
One of the first things that we learn about Polly is that she's up and left her family, and that's a bold move as a novelist because it includes a very young daughter. Can you talk a little bit about choosing that path?
Yes, I teach writing. I teach at a program at Eckerd College that was started by Dennis Lehane because it's his alma mater, and I've been teaching a writing workshop there. Goodness gracious, going back to 2006 now. I go down every January for a week. And my students are constantly getting feedback from publishers that their characters aren't likable. And I'm constantly telling my students, don't attach any importance to that word. Literature is full of unlikable people, but they're people whose company is interesting to you. They're actually saying your character is kind of uninteresting, dull, boring, and whether or not they're likable isn't really the issue. I think Polly is interesting. I think she's so unlike me. I'd come off of a book where the main character, Lou in Wild Lake, was so much intellectually like me. The way she thought, her influences, her bookishness, her competitiveness, her desire to win at any cost, those things are all drawn from my life. And now I was writing about a character who's not the least bit bookish, didn't finish college, is actually rather disdainful of those things, but has an instinct for survival that I know I created her, but sometimes I just stand back and look at Polly and think, wow, you are amazing. How did you do this? How did you decide that you would survive at any cost and achieve what you believed was necessary by any means? And I felt that for the reader, my hope was that the readers, every story has someone who's kind of the reader's stand-in, who's there to go on sort of the same journey the reader's going on. And in this story, it's Adam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who's trying to figure this woman out. He knows a little bit more about her than the reader does when the book begins. But over time, the reader comes to know much more about Polly than Adam does. And so now the reader is in the position of, oh my goodness, what's going on? Does Adam know this? Does Adam know that? And I felt to write this book, I had to be as fearless as my own main character. I was like, I really had to go for broke, be unafraid of the material, and be unafraid of going to some really dark places. And yet, this is going to sound weird. At the end of the book, I liked my two main characters very much. These two lovers who I don't think you have to read more than 2 chapters to know that something's going to happen that's not very good, and one person is going to betray the other. my hope is that people read the book trying to figure out who's going to betray whom and how.
There's a wonderful way in which she fits this archetype of the femme fatale that we've sort of developed and invested both a lot of very destructive stereotyping, but also created as a kind of a powerful figure in American film and literature. She's that, but she isn't that.
I think Polly has figured out about herself that for whatever reason, men are drawn to her. She's not really interested in the why of that. She's interested in how to exploit that. She feels that she's been badly treated by men. She's not wrong. And so she's decided to just see men almost as a kind of means to an end, whatever it takes to get what she wants. It doesn't necessarily mean sex. One thing that Polly has figured out that I think, I talk about her like I didn't create her. It's really funny to me, but because Polly's figured this out, but I haven't, which is that men really like to help women. They really do. And there is a lot of power in being that female who relies on male aid and help. Getting someone to take you to the auction so you can buy some furniture for your new apartment. Why does Adam do that? I'm not even sure he knows exactly why he's doing it, but he has a truck. She needs furniture. He ends up driving her to the auction and, even helping her buy something that's out of her price range. You see a lot of men in this novel who have helped Polly out, some of them without even realizing it. And I think she's figured out that that's a kind of power and she just needs to lean into it and use it. It's what she has. She doesn't have a degree. She doesn't have book smarts. She doesn't have money. She doesn't have any traditional aspects of power, but she can get men to help her out. And sometimes women too, but mainly men.
She also has arguably as much, if not quite a bit more intelligence than almost anyone else that she encounters.
She's really smart. But again, that's born of her belief in herself and her belief that she needs to survive, and that it's so hard to talk about this without spoilers.
Yeah, I'm aware this is one of those books that we're going to have to kind of dance around the plot developments because I would hate to spoil any of the multiple revelations.
There are a bunch. There really are. It's so funny because books are, this is a cliche, but books are, I think, like childbirth, in that looking back, I'm like, oh, this book was so easy to write. And the book I'm working on now is so impossible. And I wish I could go back to those halcyon days when I was writing Sunburn, where if I'm honest, I finished this book in December of 2016. Yeah, I finished this book a year ago. And as late as July of 2016, I was sitting in one of my best friend's gardens in London, all but crying over the book and how messed up it was. And that friend, who's a writer herself, she's written both under the name Lauren Milne Henderson and Rebecca Chance. She really guided me through some things. I mean, I find it almost disingenuous to talk about the book without talking about that moment, because there are things that if I told you 6 months before this book was finished, it was so many of its most important elements weren't even in it yet. And that talk in the garden helped me out so much. She's a good friend. We can do this for each other. But part of what she kept saying is you have to remember, it still has to be a Laura Lippman book. And you have to flip some of the things you're doing. So that still kind of amazes me. And the character of Polly is, I often miss characters when I'm done writing them, and I really miss Polly. But at the same time, I've never been more sure that a character's story is over. I mean, it's really over when it's over, and there's just no going back for any of these characters.
There's a wonderful scene late in the novel where Adam, in trying to understand something that that Polly has said, goes to a kind of a legendary specialty video store to talk to a young guy who works there, who is recommending videos for the cognoscenti of his community.
Right.
And the kind of it's a place where I suspect you're showing your hand a little bit as a lover of film, and the films, some of which might have influenced this book. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about that.
Certainly, as a lover of that particular video store, it had a branch in Newark, Delaware, which is the one in the book. But in the 90s, it was on the corner of my street in Baltimore. Yeah, I could walk there, and it was an amazing store. I think it's now a Jamba Juice. I'm not kidding.
Do they still have classic films in the Jamba Juice?
No.
Oh, that's too bad.
Oh, man. And so I do love movies, and I like some really cheesy movies. And, that comes up in this book. There's the mention of She and the leech woman. I've always been obsessed with the leech woman, which I think is some sort of weird feminist parable. Did
you see it at a special? There's a series in Baltimore. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name, but your character Polly is talking about having
Picture on a Sunday Afternoon.
Yeah, was that a real thing?
Picture on a Sunday Afternoon, which was, I think I try to mention Picture on a Sunday Afternoon in almost every book. Almost, I can't always, but I'm so old that I remember this world in which there were 3 television stations. And if you were a kid on a rainy Sunday afternoon, your whole afternoon was going to rise or fall according to what was Picture for a Sunday Afternoon, because that's all you had. You had books in your own imagination, too. It's probably to my benefit in a lot of ways. But I do love movies. And, I find I have a lot of opinions about the movies based on the work of James and Cain. I find the original Postman Always Rings Twice so much better than the remake, and the remake uses Cain's dialogue and it's more sexually explicit, but now give me Lana Turner and John Gilbert. And I've never been super fond of the Joan Crawford Mildred Pierce, primarily because it adds a murder. And also because I feel that it's very much a story about the 30s, and moving it to post-war changed a lot of the things that I liked best about it. I get it, and I got why people liked it. And this gets strange, though. Then they tried to make that super faithful Mildred Pierce on HBO, where they got everything right and every detail was perfect. It left me cold. So, I do love old movies, and I sometimes feel like when you look back at films that were made at a time where either the limitation was language or sex or not having 6 hours to tell the story, and you think those things should make things better, but sometimes I just find it so much more interesting what old movies were able to do within the limitations of time and the Hollywood studio system.
How much does writing a novel which turns deeply in its plot on violence against women feel like it? Do you feel like this is something that you're happy to have part of the conversation that's become at the center of our attention right now? Is this just this is just what the engine of your fiction is inevitably going to be?
It's a tricky question, and it's something that I think crime writers have to be really thoughtful about. If you write about crime, you're writing about violence. There are books that I find to be exploitative, that use violence as a way to make the book, in quotes, exciting, in quote. I feel like there's definitely a subgenre out there where the competition seems to be who can come up with the most depraved thing. And I do have a problem with that. I hope that what I'm writing about are the consequences of violence. Polly is someone who has certainly been on the receiving end of violence, but also been on, well, I won't say much more than that. And that I'm not doing this just to create sensation. I've had reason, I don't think I'm allowed to say why, but I've had a reason to be rewatching the entirety of The Sopranos because I'm going to be writing about something on The Sopranos. And I'm struck by the fact that it seems clear to me that David Chase understands from episode 1 that Tony Soprano is a sociopath, that most of these people are sociopaths. He doesn't glorify the violence. The way the violence is shot, it doesn't make it exciting. It's not trying, and by the time you get to the final season, he's really put his foot to the accelerator, and he's pushing it harder to let you see these are horrible people. These are terrible acts. And if you're cheering for the Soprano family to triumph over Phil Leotardo, you have really lost track of what this is about. So I do think crime fiction definitely has a responsibility not to glorify violence, not to use it for cheap sensation. I do think that we can write thoughtfully about violence against women. And my take on it, as someone who used to be a newspaper reporter, is that the way people experience the news is if something terrible happens in your city, in your neighborhood, to your neighbor, and you're reading about that in the newspaper, you're seeking for the point where you get to disconnect from the story and say, this won't happen to me. Because that's a survival technique. If you open your mind up to everything that could happen to you in a 24-hour span, you don't leave the house. You're just terrified because life is full of random and horrible things. And if you're really honest with yourself, if your neighbor got carjacked, you could get carjacked. But what we do time and time again is try to come up with a reason for why that won't happen to us. And I felt as a novelist, I can reach people when their guard is down. And I've always felt that the books that actually don't challenge people are books, as much as I love them. You know, Thomas Harris novels about Hannibal Lecter. I mean, people often forget that Hannibal Lecter is from Baltimore and is allegedly out there roaming the streets. I'm not scared of Hannibal Lecter. And if I never feel cozier than when I'm reading a book like that, that's so preposterous and over the top. It's just fun. But if someone wants to write a novel about what happens when, and this is just like off the top of my head, this didn't really happen, but I think about it. A woman sees 3 teenage boys throwing trash in the gutter, and she dares to reprimand them, and it turns out one of those boys has a gun, and there the story starts. Someone wants to write that novel, they've now broken down that wall between the reader and real life. And the reader who can't bear to contemplate a real crime and how it might happen to them can, through fiction, say, this could happen to me. This could happen to someone I love. Someone I love could do this. On a bad day, I could do this. What does that mean? Where are these problems coming from? Where is violence rooted? You know, how chance are all of these encounters? And so I feel as a novelist, we have this opportunity to get to people and really get them to think about what's going on in our culture right now, what happens between men and women. You know, it's so weird to think about the fact that I wrote Sunburn in the year before, you know, I don't really know how to talk about 2017 except to say it's kind of like the year in which every day we find out why some men suck. Not, as I said, some, not all, but it's been a weird year. And yet I think it's all in there, these dynamics of power. The one thing that is unquestionable in my mind is that so many men have had power over Polly and have been able to use her, manipulate her, punish her. And this is a book about what happens when a woman decides she's going to take the power back.
This is a tragedy to a certain degree.
It is absolutely a tragedy.
And I'm fascinated by the way that through writers like James M. Cain, and now in, I think, a great deal of the best crime fiction that has been published in the last, 20, 25 years or so, we're kind of seeing this is what American tragedy sort of looks like, I think.
There was a period of time in which it became fashionable to say that the crime novel in the 90s, when I started publishing, was taken on the mantle of the social novel. And the social novel in its day was kind of disparaged, but I think of Dreiser as being the guy.
Mm-hmm.
And Dreiser is a huge influence on me. I do think Dreiser wrote some of the worst sentences that were ever written. I mean, they're bad. And they're not just that they're of a day and a time and a style he wrote some actively bad sentences, but his insight into people, the compassion he feels, the empathy he demonstrates, even for the horrible men, for example, who take advantage of Carrie and Sister Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
He knew so much about what went on inside of people. And I do think that a lot of crime novelists sort of looked around and saw a lot of things that weren't being written about. I would say that race was not being written about in a very meaningful way in mainstream literary fiction. Certainly that has changed. And certainly one of the great things that's happening is this discussion of inclusiveness and of having more diverse voices. Crime novelists did start writing about race, and they're writing a lot about class and social injustice and what happens when you have a society where there's this huge range between the very poor and the very rich. I mean, I think a lot of George Pelecanos' novels about D.C. were really hitting on big, important social themes. And
I think from page 1 of Baltimore Blues, class and its kind of gradations within Tess Monahan's world have been, it doesn't even feel like you're trying. It just feels like that's the water that character swims in, and those mysteries take place in a world where the movements between those levels are super significant.
Baltimore has all of those things in place too. There are huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots. That's certainly not getting any better. I haven't really tried to write a modern-day Baltimore novel for a couple of years now, and the one I'm working on right now is about Baltimore in 1966, because after coming through 2016, I didn't know how to write about the present day, and I didn't want to struggle with that. I just said, I'm going to go hide in the past. 1966 in Baltimore is a pretty fun year to write about. There's a lot of stuff going on. And again, it lets me write about race in a way where I feel that I can do it. I mean, it's tricky now. The conversation is changing all the time. I wrote a book, it's been not quite 10 years ago, called Life Sentences, that was all about a white memoirist who had grown up in a school that was far more African American than white. All of her best friends were African American, and they all felt kind of betrayed by her memoir, found it very, self-centered and self-serving. And it's about what happens when she moves back home and takes on the story of one of this old gang of friends who's been accused of an unthinkable murder. Like, would I write that book today? Would I sit down and say to myself, okay, I'm going to write a book in which there are 4 African-American women of various classes and lifestyles? I don't know if I would write life sentences today, but I'm sitting there writing a book about Baltimore in 1966, and I am writing a lot of characters from an African-American point of view, but I'm so far out there now that I'm trying to almost do a doctora thing where I'm writing about real people. I want to write about the first African-American Baltimore police officer was a woman who was known as Lady Law. And in 1966, she would have been 1 year out from retirement. And I wrote this scene the other day, which was kind of crazy, and I'm still trying to tinker with it and find resources that'll help me do it better. I decided to write a very short scene from the point of view of Paul Blair, the Baltimore Oriole. I decided to describe his at-bat in a real game, and it wasn't a hugely significant at-bat, but there was an RBI, and the Orioles won 2-1. I was like, What's it like to be 22-year-old Paul Blair, who was born in Cushing, Oklahoma? It's 1966, and it's only his second full year on the team. There's so much ahead of him. He's going to win the Golden Glove. He's going to be on all-star teams, not in 66. He's going to win World Series rings. There's some baseball historians who argue that Blair has, in some ways, more significant defensive stats than Willie Mays, which I didn't know. But so on the one hand, I'm saying, oh gosh, I'd never do that again. And yet here I'm like, oh, I'm going to write from the point of view of Paul Blair.
20 novels or so into your career, and now you're still feeling like, oh, taking this real historical figure and kind of putting him on as a character in my drama is a big step. But I think that's fascinating, considering you've invented person after person after person in so many books. Is it because there's a bigger sense of responsibility?
It's a big deal. I mean, part of what I'm trying to do now is I'm working to find either tape of Blair speaking, or at least interviews where he's been allowed to speak at great length, so I can really understand his speech and what would be going on in his head and try to approximate it. I'm not trying to get away with like more than 2 pages of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's an at-bat. And I'm also just trying to figure out how baseball players really think in the moment. And I need to find some information on that. As for the Baltimore police officer who's known as Lady Law, there's enough material on her that I feel like I know who she is. And I feel like I know who she would be in this moment. This is a funny thing for someone who has written 12 books in a series to say, I cannot write the same book twice. And that's not a knock on people who have sort of created a kind of book, and that's the book they write, and the characters may change, and that's not even necessarily within a series. There's some people who write a certain type of book, and they have their things. I almost kind of admire it. I think I just get too bored. I can't do this unless I'm scared to death. Does that make sense? It's like, if I'm not scared to death, I'm doing it wrong. If I don't feel like...
You're not going to write safe. You're not going to relitigate something you've already kind of worked out.
That's it. I mean, if I ever had the sense during the writing of a book, well, this is easy, this is going very smoothly, I think I would know then that that's when the book was in trouble. And
has that happened to you? Have you had a manuscript where you felt, I need to raise the stakes in this, I need this is not challenging enough to really interest me, and you've changed the way that it's gone?
I don't think so. Typically what I do is I try to stuff them with too much stuff, and I find myself taking a lot of stuff out. When I don't remember that happening with Sunburn. I went into Sunburn thinking, I want to write the leanest book I've ever written. I want to write a tight book. I come out of journalism. There's the old cliche of, dear mom, I'm writing you a long letter because I didn't have time to write a short one. This idea that being concise is something that's actually quite difficult. And my novels had always come in at a minimum of about 90,000 words. One baggy one went all the way to 110, I think. I'm kind of embarrassed about that. And I thought, I really want to get this novel as lean as possible. My hope was to get it under 70,000 words. I didn't quite make it. I think I came in at 75. And that was hard. And it was, hard to keep all the balls in the, for sometimes I would get so lost in the story. I'd be like, who knows what? What's happening? What is Polly doing now? Wait a minute. How did that work? And
Do you use note cards? Do you use any kind of software that helps you sort of organize the scenes and pieces like that, or is it all just just written out?
I recreate a new system every time. It always involves color and charting, and it happened that while I was working on this novel, I was also at the height of my obsession with my daughter's lunchbox notes. My daughter now gets a school lunch, so I don't have to make her a lunch anymore. I don't have to write her the daily obligatory lunchbox note.
I remember the year or so of lunchbox notes.
I took lunchbox notes to a mania. I don't know why. I'm not that mom. I'm so not that mom. I mean, we were joking the other day. My kids' school, the doors open at 7:45, but you have to be in class by 8. And someone saw me on the street like at 7:45, and they thought I was walking back from school. And they're like, "Did you already get your daughter to school?" I'm like, "No, I've been at the coffee shop." They're like, "Don't worry, we're the 7:59 club. No problem." Like, still legal. She's still on time. But so I'm not that mom. I'm not a crazy. But I got really into lunchbox notes, and I had all these stamps. I had stamps. I had stickers. We kept them all. I mean, they're like little works of art. And so I cut out my stamps. I had a P for Polly, A for Adam. They each had a color assigned. I for Irving. There's, if you start thinking about how many points of view, there's Greg. There's Sue Sneed. There's Savannah.
Some of these are characters who
appear for one chapter and
just briefly.
That was different too, by the way. I was like, can I just have a character show up for one chapter? Like, why not? It's my book, Kathy's sister. So on and on, I had this all up on a chart, and I was looking at it, and that sort of helps me keep track. And I write these little charts called Who Knows What When. But this is where I got really insane last year. My stepson is very, very musical, and I'm fascinated by his musical life. He's so talented. So I decided to assign a musical note to each character, and I would then play the POV notes in order to hear what the melody sounded like. And so I was like going doink, 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 or like, I don't even remember what it was, but my theory is that if your novel is working, it has some sort of pleasing, it's going to be pleasing to the eye, pleasing to the ear, that it has these other iterations that you can create, these sort of, so my charts are really arty. On my current one, I found note cards that are hole punched, and they're really tiny, and I have a ring, and so I actually have every chapter on a ring, and I can move them around, and I fan them out like a color wheel and look at them, and I'm pretty insane on this. And I workshop a lot of students for full manuscripts, and I come in and I bring in my colored cards, and I say, okay, first thing I'm going to tell you is I've never met another writer who does it this way. You might think about that. Why am I the only one? Maybe I'm crazy, but this is what I do. And actually I have found with students, when I take them through a color-coded version of their novel and you lay it out on a huge table, and you'll say, look at this. Obviously you can't have this chapter. It doesn't make any sense. Look, it looks wrong. And there's no text in this. My whole idea is that get away from text for a while. Just look at colors, look at shapes. I've been doing this probably since it really started around my 8th novel.
I find that really fascinating because it seems like it would unlock a part of the brain that is not involved with words. I mean, I think about this sometimes because one of the things I discovered kind of, later in my life is how much I enjoy cooking. And as someone who can't shut up, I realized that one of the things that I like about it is that it quiets me down. There's a lot, and I mentioned this partially because I was thinking about this because Adam is a,
By the way, we have
chef.
We have Michael Ruhlman, who is married to my very good friend Ann Hood.
Mm-hmm. Michael Ruhlman, the wonderful chef on food and cooking.
Classically trained chef, has written some. It's really fun to go to restaurants with Michael when people figure out who he is. Every now and then you get lots of bonuses because you're. And not only are Michael and Ann married, I married them. I performed their ceremony this past April, and I asked Michael to read the book and help me get Adam right. And he had a few details, and we talked a lot about, I really did have this inspiration about grilled cheese sandwiches with bacon, which is that if there's a big piece of bacon in there, it always gets caught in your teeth and it slides off the sandwich. So shouldn't you actually chop the bacon very fine and put it in the sandwich that way? And Michael was intrigued. And he, we went over it, and then we decided at the Baltimore Book Festival that we would have sort of a taste test, and we would make 3 different grilled cheese sandwiches. And we talked a lot about this because it was really fun. It's 1995. You're in a roadside tavern restaurant in the middle of Delaware.
Yeah.
And it's June. That's why
before
there's no tomatoes on the sandwich. That
Right.
was very important to me. Like, you could not have a good tomato in Delaware in June. So Michael and I, for our demonstration, decided to make what he kept calling the grilled cheese sandwich, which was on, plain bread with American cheese, and we decided to use mayo on the outside. We'd done a lot of research by then. That detail is not in the book. I would kill to have that detail in the book, that Adam knew to put mayo on the outside. So we had the
Wait, on the outside.
on the outside.
Didn't it make it hard to handle?
No, you do it really light, and some people then do butter on the inside, but it's better for the frying. You fry, and that you get a better golden brown, and you have to be really light hand with it. So we did the really basic version, and then we did a middle version with the same bread, but we're like, well, there could be a pretty good block of cheddar in the fridge because someone made a mistake one day and everybody has bacon. And then we did a really high-end version with like the expensive cheddar, expensive bread. The bacon was similar. And then Anne was actually the taste tester, and she picked the middle sandwich, which I thought was pretty good. And Michael kept saying, and even the one's pretty good. I'm like, a grilled cheese sandwich is a great thing. And I always do stuff like that. I always try, I really care about how people do their jobs. And I wanted to get it right. And there were just a couple of little details. I remember one thing that I loved, that I never would have gotten this right without Michael, is I had a scene where Adam was making stock. And I said, Adam's making stock. And Michael said, when you're a cook, that's such second nature, you wouldn't even have the word stock go through your head. He'd be roasting the bones. And I was like, I like that better, given how much stuff catches on fire in this book. That's a better detail to me. That's more. So I loved working with him, and I'm really indebted to him. And the book is dedicated to Anne and Michael, actually, because I'm very happy for them, and they're two people who, are enjoying a much deserved late in life, amazing love affair, marriage.
Part of what makes your books stand out and kind of instantly identify themselves as Laura Lippman novels is this sense of precision around so many of the details. I feel like I'm in an absolutely precisely mapped world when I'm reading, whether it's a Tess Monahan book set in Baltimore or a novel like this. Belleville is a very, very real place. How much is that a product in your mind of research, and how much of that is a product of simply the way that you compose and bring things into life?
F. Scott Fitzgerald famously said that the test of a first-rate intellect was to hold two opposing ideas in your head at the same time. So on the one hand, I'm always thinking about what I saw one of my great idols, Donald Westlake, say at one of the first crime conferences I went to, which is, I became a novelist so I could make stuff up. And yet, if you read Westlake, the stuff he knows, and I met him one time and got to ask him, and he said, I really believe if you just think about stuff really hard, you'll get it right. The last novel he wrote was a Dortmunder novel that took place in the world of reality television. And I always thought that Westlake wrote two of the better books about journalists, despite having never been a journalist. And Trust Me on This and Baby Would I Lie. I love those books. So on the one hand, it's always, I became a novelist so I can make stuff up. But on the other hand, I'm really interested in getting things right or finding those killer details. I'm confident to the point of there's going to be a bad fall one day, but I'm always like, I can make this work. And I save research until I know what I need to know. And I will wait pretty late in the game. And I've done this ever since Baltimore Blues, where I wrote a scene where Tess Monahan had to meet with somebody in Maryland State Penitentiary who was, I believe, on death row. Although there is no death row in Maryland, that's a misnomer. So I wrote the scene, and then I went to talk to one of my coworkers. That was a great thing about working at the newspaper. There's always somebody who knew stuff. And I went to, I remember, to Pat McGuire, And I said, so you've gone to talk to people in the penitentiary. What's that like? He goes, oh, it's nothing like you would have imagined it from a movie. And what he told me was so much better. It was like, oh no, these guys, sometimes they have a great deal of privilege and they're allowed to walk around. They're like, I was like walking around with this guy. He was really well liked. Everyone was like, hi, how you doing, Bill? And I was like, okay, I can rewrite that. I really screwed up in Wild Lake and made a total bonehead error about how grand juries are conducted. And I didn't catch it myself until I was in copy edits. And I was lucky because at that point, the person...
Was it something that you'd known and forgotten, or?
I just wasn't paying attention. I kind of knew and I kind of didn't know. And I was lucky because I had the best legal fact checker I could possibly have, which was Alifair Burke, who's one of my best friends and who is a former prosecutor. And she took that copy edited manuscript on her beach vacation. And it's not only that she helped me catch it, she immediately saw the solution. I wish I had, both Michael and Alifair have that rare thing of they are experts about this world outside of the writing world, but they're also writers. And I've worked with other people who are experts and they're fantastic and I love them, but they can be kind of literal minded. And they're like, well, that could happen, but and I have to say, it's horrible. I'm telling a tale out of school. One of the most wonderful resources available to me, but sometimes one of the most frustrating, is my husband, David Simon. I mean, nobody knows more than I know about police work.
He works in television in some way, right?
Yeah, he's got a couple of things going. And I mean, obviously he knows stuff. He knows so much stuff, but he knows so much that it's like, no, I just need it to work this way. I went to him the other day and I said, I need to figure out in 1966 if I can make it credible that an African-American police officer who's on foot patrol has managed to get a car to go drop in on his girlfriend in the middle of the night. And I'm just trying to figure out, and David's like, well, there wouldn't have been that many cars in the Northwest District in 1966. He's like, okay, I get that. But let's say cars break down, it goes to a mechanic, and let's say the mechanic is a friend of the cop, and, it's like there's this 6-hour grace period between the end of the day and the next morning when the car needs to be back in commission. Could this guy, and then like 20 minutes later, okay, I get that, David, but he's the best. He's wonderful, but he knows so much. And he also, of course, does understand how you have to bend things. He loves to tell the story about when he made the television show Treme about life in New Orleans after Katrina. He brought back this beloved local pie called a Hubig's, and he actually had the Hubig's pie being eaten by people before the Hubig pie was actually available again post-storm. And it became a thing. People talked about the magic Hubigs. And, so he does understand. The magic Hubig is a really good essay waiting to be written for how, when you're a writer, when you write fiction, you want to get it right, unless you don't. And sometimes you're like, you know what? It's like, I'm going to say Paul Blair was thinking this at that at-bat in July of 1966. He's dead, so who's going to argue with me?
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I hope I made sense at some point along the way.
Thanks for listening to our conversation with Laura Lippman. To learn more about Sunburn and all of Laura Lippman's books, visit barnesandnoble.com/podcast. We've got new episodes with more fascinating voices every week, so to make sure you don't miss out, subscribe to the BNN podcast in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Bill Tipper. This episode of the podcast was produced by me, with editing and engineering by Josh Perillo. Our executive producer is Jim Mustick.
Barnes & Noble Audio.